Hello everybody, welcome to the Documentary Media Centre. Tonight is our first filmed Reportage Club, so thank you for watching. Also thank you for our audience. We've got a live audience, so we've got some questions hopefully. And introduce our guest this evening. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Angela Stienne. I'm a museum researcher and I'm an Egyptologist by training. I come from Paris, but I've been in the UK for 9 years, where I came when I was just 19 to pursue my degree of being an Egyptologist.
So when you say to people that you're an Egyptologist, what do you think they imagine that you do?
I think they imagine I do really cool things that I don't do, like reading hieroglyphs, which I absolutely cannot do, or going to Egypt a lot, which I don't really do, but I do a lot of really exciting things. I do a lot of archives and a lot of research. So I think what I mean is really I study objects related to ancient Egypt.
Okay. Now we've done some stuff before in Leicester with the New Walk Museum. We did takeover day for kids in museums, and the best thing about that project was actually taking the young people down into the basement and seeing things, according to the curators, that people who had gone to the museum before had never seen, they'd never been on display. Do you get that kind of access as well, and particularly with the project that you've done for the last year with the Science Museum?
Yes, so with the Science Museum I spend a lot of time in the storage, which actually closed quite early because they're being moved to another location, but I do spend a lot of time with collection, and especially with human remains. At the Louvre, when I did a placement in 2014, I got to spend 2 months in the storage, and that was really my dream when I was a kid, and that was brilliant. It really does not look like what you imagine. It's really not as organized as you imagine, but it's really a treasure trove, and it's really amazing. That's the best part, I think, of my job.
Now you mentioned about working in that kind of field when you were young. When did you first become interested in this subject area?
So I was about 12, 13, and I can't really remember that one day where I got interested, but I know that when you're about 12 in France, you study it in the curriculum, and by the time I was 13, I wanted to be an Egyptologist, so something happened at that time.
And is there someone that you could name that turned you on to that kind of subject as well? You thought, actually, I want to be that person rather than maybe study that subject?
I think when I started, it was more like looking at books and things like that, but I really was inspired a few years later by a woman whose name is Christiane de Roche-Noblecourt. And so she was an Egyptologist, and she was the first woman to be an Egyptologist in France. She was the curator of the Egyptian collections at the Louvre, and she worked a lot in Egypt, first a woman Egyptologist on site from France, but also she's the woman that was instrumental in moving, that really big temple, Abu Simbel, and to save it from the flooding of the Lac Nasser that was being built.
Now, we've had some interesting conversations in coffee shops over the last couple of months. The one that really struck me, you were talking particularly about this group of old white guys, who run Egyptology from the top, very carefully. So we're talking about the first female Egyptologist, maybe the first one on site, first one in charge of a collection. Really, that kind of breaking that glass ceiling is really important. Do you think that has changed now in 2020, or do you think those same prejudices still exist?
I think there are really a lot of women Egyptologists are really inspiring. I think about a colleague and a friend of mine, Monica Hanna, who is an Egyptian Egyptologist, who was doing absolutely tremendous things and was really instrumental, during the revolution in saving objects in Egypt. There's a lot of my colleagues, that the new Egyptian room at New Walk Museum has been curated by a woman. Stephanie Bunstra was a friend of mine as well. And I think the Louvre, I'm not sure, I think that's quite a very unique thing, but when I interned there, 90% of the staff were women in the Egyptian department. So it's always been a very strongly woman-led department, I think, since Christiane de Roche-Noblecourt. And so for me, that was really, I never grew up thinking, oh, that's not something I can do as a woman, because I was really sort of tremendously lucky that the model in Paris was really a place where a lot of women were.
Okay, so it was a bit of a role model.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I followed her career and all her research, and I read all her books, and I've always been really inspired by her work.
The thing I want to talk about now is moving on to the work that you've done at New Walk Museum, the labelling project. Could you tell us a little bit about how the idea came about?
So after I finished my PhD, I worked in Leicester with an organisation that works with refugees, and they were looking at events to do for Refugee Week, which happens every year in the UK in June. And I think they were really interested. So they do these events every year at the museum, but they were really looking at just a space that almost they were renting and doing music and dancings and things. And I was really interested in how they could actually use what's in the museum and how they can make it their space. And I think that really what came about is that the refugee and asylum seeker community in Leicester had not visited the museum and didn't really feel like that was their space. And so we did a lot of like visiting the museum, and I took them on tours, and we were working with people doing creative writing classes in Leicester. And so I was really interested in how they can make the collections their own. And so the idea was that they would write temporary labels for the objects in the World Arts collection, which were objects that they had really strong feelings about when we visited the museum. So it was like a temporary relabeling of the collections.
What kind of response did you get from the staff of the museum?
That was amazing, because I've worked in lots of different museums, and they were incredibly welcoming to the project. So I think Linda Harding, who's the outreach officer, is absolutely brilliant, and she really sold the project really well, and they were really interested in having it. Because it was a temporary project, I think there was not a lot of pressure, but it was so well received that then we did it again, and then they have planned to put it back on display.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I've been laughing about quite a bit since our coffee conversations is you were telling me specifically about an event that you went to where you were talking about treating mummies as refugees and stuff like that. So what kind of response did you get? Tell us that story.
So when I did this project, so basically this year I was invited to go back and to do something similar, but this time I wasn't working with other community. I was really reinterpreting the Egyptian room, and so I wanted to look at Egyptian mummies as displaced people, and this idea that sometimes we forget that they are people, but also that it's really odd that they're in Leicester of all places. And so I did this project, and it was really lovely, where you can this summer, and then I went to Turin to a conference, and so when I talked about it, generally the response was really good, but some people were really sort of reacting to it as well, if they're refugees, then does that mean the mummies have to go back? And it was sort of this idea that you want to take mummies away from us. And it was really interesting, because it's such an odd response to the idea and an odd understanding of what refugees are, and this idea that refugees really want to go back. Yes, but the refugees I work with in Leicester, they do not want to go back because their country are still at war, or they're still in a situation where they're not welcome for many reasons. And so there was such an interesting sort of flawed understanding of what being a refugee and an asylum seeker is. But also I do believe that if Egypt wants their mummies back, they should go back. So there's always this idea. It's such a part of the debate of repatriation. These mummies that are here, for example, are not being claimed by Egypt. So that was it's also another layers where I think there is a lack of understanding of this.
One of the other things, you sent so many interesting things to me. We were in the coffee shop. I remember making loads of notes afterwards, just thinking, I'm not even sure how we're even going to cover so many of these areas. But one of the things that really struck me was you said that there are no royal mummies outside Egypt.
Yes, so I think
any of the mummies that we see are actually...
When I did my PhD, I spent a lot of time at the British Museum, and there's a mummy called Cleopatra, and so I kept seeing people being like, oh my god, this is Cleopatra. And it's not, because the famous Cleopatra is Cleopatra 7, so there's a lot of people that had the same name, which is a bit like the Ramses, there's more than one. There are no royal mummies outside of Egypt, or at least non-identified royal mummies, because they're all in Egypt, and the few that were in other countries have been repatriated, and they're all sort of in Cairo. So what we have are like nobles or like wealthy people, but we do not have royal mummies outside of Egypt.
Wow, I never realised that. Actually, that was quite surprising when you said that to me. Now, let's move into your mummy stories area, because I think that's fantastic. As a freelance journalist, I'm particularly interested in that you've started this blog and the kind of response that you've got as well. So how did the idea originally come about?
When I was doing my PhD, I was finding lots of interesting stories that didn't really fit in my thesis. So actually, when it was created, the idea was that I would share some stories. But a lot of the conversations I was having with people, or the conferences I would go to, there seemed to be always this idea that people love mummies, that everyone loves mummies. But then I would talk to actual real people, and they were like, oh, I just, I don't think they should be in museums, or I feel really uncomfortable. I once took someone to the British Museum and was like, actually, can we leave? I just don't feel comfortable, seeing dead people. So actually the responses were a lot more than, oh, everyone likes mummies. And I was really interested in getting a better idea of what people actually think, because we don't really do sort of audience consultation, and when we do in museums, I think, you know, they're really flawed, and if you ask people, they'll be like, yes, but it's not, you know, it's really hard to get a real understanding of how people feel, but also not just sort of European people, because what I've learned through mummy stories is that some people have never seen mummies, because, for example, in Asia there's no Egyptian mummies if it's not during the exhibitions. So my idea was really to get people to send their stories of encounters, what they think, and not having any censor. So if they don't like mummies, then they could just write it, and there was really no platform where people could share their personal opinion.
Okay. I never realised as well until I went to New York, the toes are showing on one of the mummies, until you pointed it out to me, and I kind of walked in and I was like, oh yes, it is a person. And I think that conversation with you and then visiting the next time was the first time I'd really made a connection with the fact that there was someone inside. And that's really interesting, because you've also broadened your mummy stories out to include other forms of, you know, talking about maybe death and other kind of remains and human remains and stuff like that. Have you had as many responses along that lines as you have around the mummies?
So interesting, in the first year, I said I would only do Egyptian mummies, and then I kept having people being like, oh, can I write about this? But it's not Egyptian. And I was like, no, it's really a project about Egyptian mummies. And then by the end of the year, I was like, oh, we're missing so many like interesting stories. So I decided to open it. Since I opened it, everyone wants to write about Egyptian mummies. Okay. But we do have a bit more diversity, but still, actually, I think, you know, there's a lot of people that I've just received 2 new stories this week, and they're both about Egyptian mummies. Okay. But I have people contacting me, and no, I think there's a lot more also maybe research and a lot more into other human remains that people were not really looking at from a like sort of public engagement point of view. So I think, you know, there was a lot more conversation happening around Egyptian mummies. But it's really interesting for me to look sort of more broadly.
Now, mentioning mummies, I've got some National Geographics on display here and outside. National Geographic was the way we used to learn about the world before the internet. And my students just look at me completely blank, as if like, what, the world didn't exist before the internet? And in one of the books it says from 1965, which is a year older than me, that there's been 15 front covers of National Geographic that have had anything that relates to Egypt. And I discovered I had 12. Bizarrely, I've got quite a lot of National Geographics upstairs, collected by accident. And it led me really to look at some of the other covers as well, where there were Inca mummies and Mayan mummies and stuff. And that led to my ask you that question about, I always assumed a mummy was Egyptian, but that's not true, is it?
Well, so the origin of, I think, you know, there's so many words that we use like this, and we really don't know where the word comes from. So the origin of the word mummy has very little to do with an Egyptian mummy, and it comes from the ancient Persian mumia. And so what it refers to is this black substance that was covering supposedly Egyptian mummies when they were discovered, which people thought was bitumen. And so mumia comes from the same word as bitumen. And people thought Egyptian mummies were covered in bitumen. And then there's a lot of really quite fascinating and absolutely horrendous stories about mumia, because for a long time the black substance was thought to be the same thing that you would find in the Red Sea. And so it was basically something that people would use as medicine. So in Europe, there was a long history of mummies being grounded into powder to use this product that was medicinal, and so people would eat mummies. And so when you use mummy every day, you don't really think that there's this entire story. So yes, it was associated to Egyptian mummies, but actually it's the name of a sort of medicinal product that was used up to like sort of 18th century, which is quite terrifying. But so the word really has been attributed to Egyptian mummies. It's now being used for all sort of preserved or artificially preserved human remains. But in itself, I think, you know, it's quite an interesting story for the name, but it is not really associated. It's been used for a really long time for Egyptian mummies only, but also because, you know, we discovered South American mummies later and so on. So no, people do use, you know, they say Egyptian mummies and then they say South American mummies or something like that.
So the next point I want to talk to you about is popular culture, because when we were in a coffee shop, this is kind of when you were like, oh, okay, this is good. I want to get into this conversation with you. And I was saying about, you know, obviously you've got the Mummy Returns, Mummy and the Dragon Tomb Emperor or whatever. There was the new Mummy with Tom Cruise running like he always runs. And then we were talking about that whenever you see anything that relates to mummies, they're a bit like the equivalent of someone with some form of disability or disfigurement is a Bond villain. So they're a very easy thing to have as sort of coming awake and maybe attacking people, which again was very much, I think, how the New Walk Museum's previous exhibition was quite scary Boris Karloff in the corner. Now I said to you about, do you think that popular culture has shaped and damaged our view of mummies? And you were like, John, that's what fiction's meant to do. It's a story. And of course, then she leant in and said to me, as someone who runs the documentary media centre that deals with documentary, maybe non-fiction needs to step up and start putting some of these... And that was a really interesting point, that you weren't just willing to turn around and blame popular culture. You were actually saying some of the non-fiction that's about it isn't necessarily good enough or correct. And you said that also is the same about museums as well.
Well, I just think, like every time there's a new mummy movie or something related to Egypt, and there's been a lot recently, and I mean, historically they're pretty atrocious, they really don't follow facts, but they're movies, and so every time they just get blamed for like, people are going to think that's what we do. I mean, archaeologists are portrayed in like, there's nothing like we do, just like, librarians in movies and things like that, or curators for that matter. But they're movies, and I think that the problem is that maybe we don't have anything to counteract this idea. So there's very little books on very few books on Egypt or on mummies or on museums. In fact, that are really nicely accessible and well documented and things like that. So we just can't blame Hollywood for because that is their job, that is what they do. But I think that we just need more people to talk about historical facts, and when I talk about my research on human remains and race or things like this, very few people have heard of it. So I think what we need is not to blame Hollywood, but actually make nicely well documented books or documentaries or things like that actually bring the facts. I think it's just a bit too easy to say they do it wrong. I don't think we're doing it right now.
I was sitting there with my coffee in the coffee shop like this going, oh right, okay, I hadn't really thought of it like that. Okay. Anybody got a question they want to ask? I'm assuming there were a few people primed. Yes.
One of the things that I found really interesting when we went to the Egyptian exhibit recently at New Walk is the idea of DNA testing the mummies, especially around Richard III and how his body was DNA tested. And you said that you were uncomfortable with that idea, besides the obvious of kind of prodding and prying with human remains, because of the appropriation of mummies by scientific racists historically, which I thought was really interesting. I was just wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, so actually I've spent the whole of 2019 thinking, having the opportunity to get involved in a project to do DNA testing and thinking, maybe I'd do it, maybe I shouldn't do it, maybe I do it. So I ended up not doing it. And the reasons are, first, I think that, there is a thing where I grew up with mummies. It sounds very odd when I say it that way, but, since I was really young, I'd go to museums and I'd talk to the mummies and, and it's been all my research. And so I do, people ask me if I think they're objects or people. For me, they're obviously people. And so I felt very uncomfortable with the idea that we were just going to, drill a hole in the mummies to hopefully find DNA, which obviously Egyptian mummies are not only really old, but they've gone through completely different climate variation, which can affect DNA. So it's, the chances we would find anything are very low. But also my main issue is, what are we trying to find out when we do DNA testing? And I think DNA testing is such a hot topic at the moment. Everyone's getting DNA tested. What is the information that we don't have that we really need? And I think that there are none that we really need. And the problem is, like, a lot of my research has been into looking at people doing tests into, obviously, at the time it was like craniometry and things like this in the 18th, 19th century to find out the origins of the ancient Egyptian. And the idea in England and in France at the time, at the turn of the 19th century, was to prove that the ancient Egyptians were white people. And that was because, there was an era of colonialism, and we really wanted to, there was no, in France, there's writings, done by people like Georges Cuvier that really say it is not possible that our civilization, our culture, the law, so much that we learned from Egypt at the time, it was the cradle of civilization, that it could have been created by non-white people. And so this entire collecting in natural history museums, especially, was done to prove the racial origins of ancient Egyptian. And so when now we have people that really get excited about, finding out again where did they come from? What was their origin? That really bugs me, because I think, we're having this return into this obsession of finding where people come from. And the thing is, in museums, most museums, the well-preserved mummies are later period mummies. So, for example, when people in the 18th, 19th century, they were studying Egyptian mummies, most likely when they found out that these mummies were sort of white origin, they were probably right, because, Egypt was invaded by Greece and Rome. So there were a lot of people that were sort of mainly of Caucasian origin that would be there. And so they used this as an evidence for 3,000 years of history. And that means that what if we do a test in, a museum like Newark Museum, and we find out that these mummies are from, mainly a white origin? What are we going to do with this information? Because it can be used so wrongly by people being like, well, see, we've got two mummies and they're white. And I think that in the current climate, we really do not need this. And I think, there's so much information, there's so many ways to prove that we already know that ancient Egypt was, a complete melting pot, that we really do not need to do DNA testing today, I think.
That's a really interesting point, because you mentioned also about race studies and stuff, and we were talking about the Black Pharaohs, and actually I found one of the covers actually says that in 2005, I think it is, the sort of the Nubian connection and stuff. And a lot of it's saying, I was reading the article today in preparation for tonight, and it was saying that all evidence of him has been removed. On all the frescoes, it's been chiselled out and stuff, and literally there's the only piece of evidence is on one where everything has gone apart from the fact that he's got dark skin. That's the only piece of evidence.
I mean, there's just a lot of there is a period in Egyptian history where there were black pharaohs, and it's a brilliant period. I mean, and if you go in these regions like Kerma, you can see the archaeology right now. It was absolutely outstanding. There's two things: representations in art in ancient Egypt is symbolic. So, if someone is white, that doesn't mean they were white. A lot of the iconography is really complex and it's really symbolic. And also, it's a very common practice to have people erased from monuments and things like this. But just like Tutankhamun was erased from monuments, or Akhenaten, his father, who's, here, was erased from monuments. So these are, used in, it's the way you use the, archaeology is a very problematic field, because so many times people have been using, evidence as an evidence of what they wanted to demonstrate. So that's really interesting. It's just it's so simple to just acknowledge that they were people from everywhere, because geographically Egypt was a brilliant place, to have people coming from Greece, to have people, all over the world. But there's still a very strong obsession. Last year I was contacted to do a documentary, and they were like, can you talk about whether the ancient Egyptians were black or not? And it's still, it's still a topic but it comes up, same thing for Rome, and, when Mary Bird had this article, it was a massive thing. So there's still, there's a big revival of where do people come from.
So I'd like to talk to you now a little bit about finding Tutankhamun, because I was reading today, again, in preparation for this evening, about most people thought that there was nothing left in the Valley of the Kings to find. And Carter went round and he was documenting in great detail where all the piles of dirt were from other people's digs. And they said there was one red triangle on his map, so again I'm not going to ask you whether this is true or not, that had a pile of dirt from another dig on it, and he was convinced, a bit like Richard III that you mentioned, who was under the car park, that actually the entrance was under there, and obviously they found one step, and then it led to this discovery. Is that true? Is that a myth? Is it something that's been, the finder has shaped the narrative?
It is true that, it was a real exercise in perseverance, because he did dig for a while, and every time his, funding would run out, and then he had to convince people that there was something left, and really, at some point no one really wants to believe it. But as you said, a bit like Richard III, you really have to persevere. He was really convinced that there was something, so yes, but I think, it really is also a very big team effort, so there's a lot of people that were looking for it. Those steps were found by some of the Egyptian workers. I think that's this story is a bit simplified sometimes.
I think we mentioned climbing Everest. A lot of people think that Sherpa Tenzing got to the top and then Hillary got there after him. And you were saying about probably the little hole that Carter went through. There was probably an Egyptian, unnamed Egyptian that went through there first and then came back, and then everyone else piled through. It actually caused quite a lot of bad feeling with the Egyptians at the time, didn't it? Because it said in the permit that they were not allowed to go in until the Egyptian authorities were there, and obviously Carter Lord Carnarvon and his daughter actually went in and it caused quite a lot of...
Yes, definitely. I think, there's a lot that's really romanticized about this discovery, but of course, there's this idea that the English were really doing what they wanted to do, and they were sort of obstructing things and were really trying to get the press attention, and then it brought so much press attention that it was a bit too much for the site as well. There's a lot that is really being glossed over. I mean, obviously it's a tremendous discovery, but I think we forget a lot about the Egyptian workers that are really involved, and that's something that really still needs to change. And these narratives are really not being discussed. Even in the great exhibition that's in London at the moment, we're really missing this part of the history. But also, at the time, there was still this idea that we wanted to find really beautiful, amazing objects, but the way to extract them was a bit dodgy at the time. And something that's really interesting is that if you think about Tutankhamun, you always think of the mask, but no one thinks about the mummy. And I don't, people have visuals about the mummy of Ramses II, for example, with the hair, really. Not many people have visuals of them, in their mind of the mummy of Tutankhamun, and that's because it's really heavily damaged from taking all these objects of the mummy, because with time resins really sort of sticks to the mummy, and at the time it was really like, oh, look at this really nice mask, but actually if you look at the mummy now, it doesn't look that great.
It's been quite heavily damaged and stuff like that. Okay. We had a question from the audience?
Yeah, I guess my question is around the ethics of the display of human remains, which I know is something you've thought about. I don't like human remains in museums very much. I don't like going and finding skeletons. I'm not very keen on mummies, because, like you've already said, they're people, not objects. So why are they there as a sort of thing for voyeuristic tourists to go in and stare at and look at? And I think very often in terms of Egyptology, it can be to the expense of other material culture. So if you go into the galleries in New Walk, it feels like the room where the mummies are is very kind of beautifully designed and curated, perhaps a little bit to the expense of some of the incredible artefacts that are actually in the other space. So I guess my question is twofold, which is what do you think we gain from displaying mummies specifically? How do we navigate the ethics, and do they actually distract us from other aspects of ancient Egyptian material culture from which we might actually be able to gain a greater understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization
and learn something as well? Learn something. Great question.
I think that it really is such an issue, and it's such a complex issue, the display of human remains in museums. It's really interesting because I think in the UK there really is this very big emphasis on Egyptian mummies. When I grew up in Paris, the Louvre at the time only had one mummy on display, and it's really hidden. It's actually still really quite difficult to find. What it has 2 floors of material culture, so they don't really have any interest in mummies. They're not on the maps of the museums and things like this. Well, you go to the British Museum and there's 13 on display. So a really big contrast, and actually if you go to the Louvre you will really see a lot of objects, and chances you will actually miss the mummy because it's quite an obscure location. So that's quite interesting that yes, in this country there really is a big emphasis on human remains. I think that one I always try to think of, what if we don't put them on display? Then what happens? Because the thing is, as people have suggested, sometimes when I give talks, you cannot put them back in their tombs. There's so many factors, from the fact that they're not really safe place once they've been opened because they're quite easy to locate, to the fact that change of atmospheres and things like this are not good environments. So then I think, okay, then they would go in storage. And then I've been to so many storage that have been absolutely horrible places for human remains, and I still think of so many that today are really horrible places for human remains. So what I think is, okay, so what do we do? And we have some on display. Obviously, we don't have, apart from New Walk, but because it has a small collection where they're all on display, a lot of museums are a bit half and half. There's a really big trend in taking them off display in museums in the UK because of ethical concerns. It's really difficult to think, what is the value and why do we put them? People like seeing them, a lot of people do, but then the more I talk to people, the more I realize that is really not a universal feeling. the one thing that I'm really quite sort of strict about is making sure that museums put warning signs. So you have this even at Newark, but that's a new thing, you didn't have this in the other gallery. Because you should give a choice, and a lot of people are really uncomfortable. And even I go to some galleries, that recently open, and I just turn around and there's a skeleton, and I'm really used to it, but I still think that's not what I was coming to see. And sometimes there's some collections that are, especially not in Egyptian collections, but in other collections where you wouldn't necessarily expect to see human remains. So I think that's really important that, we have this separation and that we don't create an environment where mummies are an attraction, so I think some big museums really are doing this, and that's a bit of a problematic, because also I think that the way you react in a museum and the way you act, is really heavily influenced by the environment. So, when it's like a really big mass display of human remains and it's in the corridor, and, this idea of respect, whatever you mean by it, is really, hard to enact. But I think that... I think there's just, a lot you can learn about human remains. I think that for me, there's, if they're on display and they're well displayed, for me, it's always been a story of like encountering people, and I always felt, really humble, and I always, felt very privileged with this idea that I would meet people from, 3,000 years ago. But I think that this is not necessarily something that's being really well done in museums. But I do, the thing is, ideally we would have never unearthed them, and that's a very ideal view, but it's too late by a few centuries. and there's so many in museums. So what I try to think about is like, what can we do, because this idea of being respectful by removing them from display, it's a great one in theory, but if you end up putting them in boxes on the floor, which I have seen in many places, is that really more, respectful? So it's really, what do we do now? And I think that a lot of the conversation are like, oh, we shouldn't have done this before in the past. But the reality is like, we have museums and we have all these displaced people that are, in museums. What do we do? How do we engage? So I really try to make, people realize that they're people. And it seems very basic, but actually, it's really an important first step where, when I grew up at the Louvre, I'd see people knock on the case, and I'm like, well, if you realize this is, a deceased person, that really does not sound like a natural reaction to have. But it's just, it's been so objectified. So it's doing small steps, and I don't have, as yet a solution to this. How do we ethically display human remains? Also because we don't really know what their idea of ethic, what is ethics, and how, what's respect for them at the time. So we have a very complex history. I mean, it's a very controversial history that brought them to being here in museums today. So for me, the first steps would be giving people a choice. I think is a non-negotiable, whether they want to see it or not. Because I think, like many people, I think that museums should be, a safe space, and it should be a space where, you can relax and enjoy. And if you're, uncomfortable for any reasons with the idea of human remains, you should have a choice.
And I suppose also taking things off a display and then putting them back into the storage area is not reinterment either, is it? So there's no respect with someone, like you said, some of the things. I mean,
Egyptian mummies are quite specific. There are some great cases of repatriation, reinterment for other human remains, but I think for ancient Egypt, it's such a massive scale as well that I think people don't realize how many human remains are out of the country in museum storage, across the world.
I often say to the students when we're talking about different subjects like this, particularly anything that's historical, I always say, well, look at it through the lens of today. If we were to suddenly decide we were going to put a display on of the South Asian tsunami, and so someone's got, got the hut, they've got the train, they've got the film, someone's got the train carriage from Sri Lanka, those kind of things, and then someone said, well, actually, I've dug up 4 people to show you what it looked like once you'd been buried under all this. So, and I'm not sure we're necessarily at the point where we'd even get the ethics of that right now. So kind of looking back to people that weren't really caring about that, it was more about putting it on display. And some of the books that I've been going through as well over the last couple of days show that sort of Tut fever, sort of post-Carter finding Tutankhamun, sort of, display at the Crystal Palace, those kind of things. It kind of caught everybody's attention. Of course, then it was very much a driven event around entertainment and media, wasn't it?
I think there's definitely this passion for ancient Egypt. I think what we're missing is like, you know, this idea of ethics is great, but no one can really define what it is. I think that we need a better understanding of the history that brought all these objects and these people to Europe. And then we just need to like bring more emotions in the museum. I think that's really all in the conversations in general. And, you know, really like talking about, you know, how do people feel about seeing human remains? How do they feel about seeing objects? We need to talk more to, you know, Egyptian people and get them more involved in the conversation. So there's still a lot to do, you know, and to really change this narrative, because the so-called tooth fever is really a sort of a European American concept. And it's, you know, so distant from what we're actually looking at.
The last thing I want to talk to you about is Mummy Stories, obviously the blog, which we've touched on a little bit, but actually you want to turn it into a book, because you were saying though, sort of going to a train station, picking up a book, sort of something that's enjoyable, maybe explains it a little bit more, maybe with some sort of stories and stuff. How far are you along with that idea?
Well, I think that, you know, when we were talking about popular culture, I was really thinking that what we're missing is some great, you know, books that people can read, and some, you know, great stories, and Mummy Stories, the blog is brilliant, but it's really about sort of people bringing their stories. But when I do my research, I come across so many sort of fascinating, sometimes really quite odd and you know, very interesting stories of people encountering Egyptian mummies through time. So my project is really that the next step for Mummy Stories would be a collection of stories sort of through time of people encountering Egyptian mummies and having lots of different angles, but something that's really accessible that people can buy in train stations.
That is not necessarily academic.
Oh no, well, so I'm working on an academic book, but this one would definitely just be like, you know, a nice collection, like you have mythology books, which have, you know, a nice collection of stories. So I really want something that's just interesting and fascinating and show you different perspectives that anyone can read.
And the academic book, what's that about?
So I'm turning my PhD thesis into a book, and so this is more academic, but I'm really interested in looking at this 18th, 19th century and how, you know, attitudes with Egyptian mummies at the time are really shaping the way we're doing things in museums today.
So just as we finish, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and also obviously to yourself, taking the time this evening to talk to me. Can you tell us where we can find you on social media, and also where we can find out more about Mummy Stories?
So all of the information about Mummy Stories is on mummystories.com with all the stories that have been sent, and you can find us on Facebook looking for Mummy Stories, and on Instagram.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening. You can find out more information about those links, which will be in the descriptor below, and also a little bit more about the Documentary Media Centre and some of the other reportage clubs that we've got coming up. Thank you for watching.